She called his name like a wife. He answered like a man who had already replaced her. That was the moment Elena Vaughn understood that the two people she trusted most in this world had been lying to her face, possibly for years. Her husband's voice through that study door wasn't guarded or careful. It was warm, familiar. The kind of warm you only get with someone you've touched in the dark. Elena stood in her own hallway, still in her coat, still holding the ultrasound photo she'd been clutching since she left the clinic. 8 weeks. A heartbeat the size of a thumbnail. The greatest secret she'd ever kept, and she'd been 40 minutes from telling him. She never made it through that door. If you've ever stood still while your entire life rearranged itself around you, if you know what it feels like to hear something you cannot unhear, then stay with me. Because what Elena did next wasn't what anyone would expect. It wasn't what even she expected. This is her story. If it reaches you wherever you are tonight, hit the like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this has traveled. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. I promise you, it only gets more unforgivable from here. The surgery had run 4 hours longer than scheduled. Elena didn't complain. She never did. When the attending resident had flagged the internal bleed at hour 2 and the anesthesiologist had quietly suggested they might want to close and reassess, Elena had looked at the numbers on the monitor and said, flatly, "We're not closing." That was it. No speech, no drama. Just a woman who understood that the patient on the table had a 19-year-old son waiting outside, and that son was going to need his father to walk out of this hospital. He walked out. Elena changed out of her scrubs in the attending lounge, alone. Most of the surgical staff had cleared by then. It was past 11, and the locker room smelled like industrial soap and that particular brand of exhaustion that settles into hospital walls after decades of absorbing other people's worst days. She pulled on her street clothes slowly. Her back ached. Her feet were past the point of feeling. She sat on the bench for a moment with her coat half on, and she reached into the interior pocket where she'd folded the ultrasound photo that morning before her shift. She'd meant to keep it flat. She'd done a poor job of it. The corner was bent, and one edge had picked up a faint crease from being pressed against her chest. ID badge all day, but the image was still clear enough. A small white blur against gray, a comma, a suggestion of a person. She pressed her thumb against it like she was trying to take a pulse. 8 weeks. She'd only confirmed it 2 days ago, at a clinic across town where no one knew her name. She hadn't wanted to find out at her own hospital, not with colleagues who would read her face before she'd had a chance to arrange it. Not before she'd told Adrian. She'd been planning how to tell him for 48 hours. She'd rehearsed it 3 times on the subway ride home. The plan was simple. She would walk in, ask him to sit down, and give him the photo. She would watch his face. She had been married to this man for 6 years. She knew his face better than she knew her own. She flagged a cab outside the hospital. October had turned serious in the last week, the kind of cold that meant business, that came in off the Hudson with intent. She got in the back and gave the address and watched the city move past the window, bright and indifferent, and tried not to let herself feel too much of what she was feeling. She was 39 years old. She had a demanding career and a complicated marriage, and a body that had spent the better part of 3 years telling her this was unlikely. And now here she was, a comma on a gray screen, a heartbeat the size of a thumbnail. She let herself have it for about 4 blocks. Then she put it away and watched the traffic. The Volkov townhouse was on the Upper East Side, a 4-story limestone building that Adrian had purchased the year they got married, 6 years ago. It was the kind of property that didn't get listed publicly. It moved through intermediaries, through the kind of people who made phone calls rather than submitted online inquiries. Adrian had told her it had belonged to a financier. She had not asked which one. The lights on the upper floors were off. The study was on the 2nd floor, front-facing, and through the tall windows she could see the warm amber glow of the desk lamp Adrian favored. He was there. She'd half expected him to be out. He kept hours she'd stopped questioning years ago. But he was home. She let herself in through the front door quietly. Not out of stealth. She wasn't hiding. She was just tired, and the house had a particular acoustic quality that meant heels on the marble foyer at midnight had a way of sounding like an announcement. She took off her shoes at the door. Old habit. The hallway was dim. The housekeeper had already left. She could hear faintly the sound of Adrian's voice from behind the study door. She almost knocked. Her hand was actually raised. Then she heard the laugh. It wasn't his professional voice, the one he used on calls with lawyers and business associates, smooth and measured, the verbal equivalent of a tailored suit. This was the other one. The private one. Lower in register, almost lazy. The one he used when he was at ease with someone. Elena had not heard that voice directed at her in 2 years. She lowered her hand. She wasn't listening on purpose. That's what she would tell herself later for about a week before she stopped pretending the distinction mattered. The truth was that something in the quality of that laugh held her in place the way a hand on your shoulder holds you in place. Firm, specific, impossible to ignore without a conscious decision to ignore it. She won't cause any problems. Adrian's voice, still in that register. Easy, like he was talking about a scheduling conflict. Whitmore's had the evaluations drafted for 3 months. We just need the timing to be right. A pause. He was listening to whoever was on the other end. The gala. A short sound, almost amused. 3 weeks. That's when it makes the most sense. Everyone who matters will be there. She'll be there. And when Whitmore presents his findings, another pause. Shorter. Yes. In front of all of them. That's the point. Elena's hand, which had been hanging at her side, closed around the strap of her bag. She pressed her back against the wall beside the door. She was not a woman who pressed herself against walls. She was a surgeon. She stood straight. She had been told by multiple people over the course of her life that she had excellent posture and an intimidating stillness about her, and she had always accepted this as a professional compliment. She was standing against a wall at midnight in her own hallway. After that, the divorce is a formality. Adrian's tone had shifted slightly. More businesslike, but still loose, still comfortable. The inheritance goes into the trust structure we built last year. Her father's estate attorney is the only complication, and Brennan's already taken care of that angle. She heard him move, the particular creak of his desk chair when he leaned back in it. Sonia's ready. The easy warmth came back into his voice when he said the name, like the word itself was a thing he enjoyed the shape of. She understands the timeline. After the gala, I'll be free to make the introduction properly. The hallway was very cold. Elena couldn't tell if the heat had dropped or if it was just her blood redirecting itself with animal efficiency away from her skin and toward her core, the body's ancient response to something it perceives as threat. Sonia. There was only one Sonia. There was only one person in Elena's life named Sonia, and that was Sonia Belair, who had been her closest friend since they'd met at Columbia 15 years ago. Sonia, who had been at their wedding, who had called Elena on the night of her father's death and stayed on the phone until 4 a.m, who had been in this house, at this dinner table, 43 days ago. Elena could count it, because it was the last dinner party she'd hosted before the surgical schedule had gone into crunch, and who had kissed Adrian on the cheek when she left and said, to Elena, "You are so lucky. You know that?" Sonia. Elena stood in the hallway and did not move for 60 seconds. She counted. Behind the door, Adrian said something else. She didn't register it. She was still counting. When she reached 60, she made a decision. She didn't push through the door. She didn't scream. She didn't stand there and wait for him to come out and perform the specific cruelty of watching his face try to reassemble itself into something innocent. She turned around. She picked up her shoes from where she'd left them at the door. She walked out of the townhouse. She pulled the door shut behind her with both hands and held the handle for a moment to make sure the latch caught without sound. Then she stood on the front steps of her own home in her bare feet on cold stone and held an ultrasound photo against her sternum and breathed. 10. She did not sleep that night. She didn't try. She went to a hotel 8 blocks away, the kind of mid-tier business hotel that doesn't ask questions and doesn't notice anyone, and she sat on the bed with her coat still on and her phone face down on the bedspread, and she laid the ultrasound photo on the pillow beside her, and she looked at the ceiling and she thought, not in the loose, searching way of someone who doesn't know what to think. Elena's mind didn't work like that under pressure. It had never worked like that. This was what made her a surgeon, not just a doctor, the ability to be frightened and precise at the same time, to let the fear exist without letting it run the room. She thought about what she knew. Adrian was having her declared mentally incompetent. He had a psychiatrist, Whitmore, a name she'd heard twice in professional contexts, a man she'd briefly met at a hospital function 2 years ago, who had apparently drafted forged evaluations. The gala, 3 weeks from now, was not just a charity event. It was a stage set. He was going to destroy her reputation in front of every person who mattered in this city, and then take her inheritance, her father's money, the estate that had taken her mother 5 years of legal work to secure, and walk out of the marriage with Sonia Belair on his arm and enough legal cover to make Elena's objections sound like symptoms. That was the machine. She could see its shape now. She laid out every piece she had. Her inheritance. That was the target. She had known, in a vague way that she'd never fully examined, that Adrian's various business interests were not entirely clean. She was not stupid. She had chosen, in the way that some people who love difficult people choose, not to look too directly at certain things. She had told herself it was compartmentalization. She understood now that it had been closer to willful blindness. She thought about Sonia. She let herself feel that for exactly 4 minutes. She had known this woman for 15 years. She had held her hand in an emergency room once, after a car accident that had turned out to be less serious than it first appeared. And she had felt Sonia's pulse underneath her fingers, strong, a little fast. And she had thought, I would do anything for this person. She had meant it. She had been a fool. She let herself sit with that without arguing against it. 4 minutes. Then she stopped. There was something more important than Sonia right now. There was something more important than the marriage, the betrayal, the particular sourness of discovering that the person you trusted most after your husband had been lying to your face, possibly for years. All of that was real, and it was going to demand its due eventually, but it was not the most important thing. She pressed one hand flat against her lower abdomen, not a dramatic gesture, just a hand, just a fact. She was 8 weeks pregnant. She was alone in a hotel room at 1 a.m, and if Adrian succeeded in having her declared mentally unstable before she could establish a counterposition, she would lose everything: her medical license, potentially her freedom, certainly her child. She was a trauma surgeon. She had spent her career walking into rooms where everything was already wrong, assessing the damage with as much honesty as she could manage, and deciding what to do next. She assessed the damage. Then she started making decisions. The first call she made was to Marcus Hale. She made it at 6:30 in the morning when she calculated he would be awake. Marcus had been her father's attorney for 20 years, a careful, almost excessively methodical man in his early 60s who had overseen the entirety of her father's estate and who had, in the years since her father's death, called her once a year on her father's birthday because he considered it a professional courtesy that had quietly become a personal one. She trusted him the way she trusted very few people, not because he was warm, but because he was consistent. He picked up on the second ring. "Elena." His voice was careful. "It's early." "I know," she said. "I need to meet with you today. Not at your office, somewhere else." A pause. "Is this about the estate?" "It's about several things. Some of them concern the estate. Some of them concern my husband." Another pause. Longer. Marcus Hale had not reached his professional position by being slow to understand context. "The coffee place on Lexington," he said, "near 72nd. Do you know it?" "I'll find it." 10 o'clock. She hung up and sat for a moment with the phone in her lap. Then she turned it over, removed the SIM card, and thought about what else she needed to do before 10 o'clock. She needed clean clothes. She needed to appear at the hospital for morning rounds, as if nothing had happened, because the worst thing she could do right now, the most dangerous thing, was change her behavior in any way that Adrian's people might notice. If he had surveillance on the house, which she now assumed he did, then her not coming home last night was already a variable she'd introduced. She needed to build an explanation that held up. She had worked overnight shifts before. She kept a spare set of clothes in her locker for that reason. It wouldn't raise questions. She washed her face in the hotel bathroom. She looked at herself in the mirror for a long moment. She looked, she thought, like someone who had been awake all night, which was accurate. She also looked like someone who was frightened, which was also accurate. She allowed both of these things to be true. Then she arranged her face. She was good at that. She had been good at it for a long time. She got through rounds on 4 hours of total sleep and 2 cups of bad coffee, and the specific compartmentalization she had developed over years of functioning in environments where falling apart was not an option. She checked her surgical schedule. She spoke to 3 residents. She reviewed a post-op chart and made 2 notations and disagreed, professionally and without drama, with an attending's recommendation on a dosage adjustment. She did all of this while a part of her brain, the part that had been running continuously since 11:42 the previous night, sorted through everything she'd heard in that hallway. Whitmore. She knew that name. She pulled it into focus now, gave it her full attention. Dr. Gerald Whitmore, forensic psychiatrist. She had met him at a hospital benefit 2 years ago and found him slick in a way she had not bothered to examine at the time because she'd had no reason to examine it. He had a private practice and a reputation in certain legal circles as an expert witness. She understood now what kind of expert witness. Forged evaluations. The phrase had a clinical sound that didn't match what it actually meant, which was that a man she'd met at a party was being paid by her husband to construct a medical fiction that would be used to erase her. She thought about the gala. 3 weeks. She was scheduled to attend that event. It was a charity function that Adrian hosted annually for a consortium of donors whose actual function she had never mapped out in detail. She had attended the previous 2. She'd worn a black dress the first year and a deep burgundy one the second. She had shaken hands and made conversation and watched Adrian work a room the way he always worked a room, with that particular fluency he had, that ability to make each person feel momentarily like the most important person present, which Elena now understood was a skill that served more than one purpose. 3 weeks. She thought about what 3 weeks meant, what she could build in 3 weeks if she was very careful. At 9:50, she left the hospital in street clothes and took the subway rather than a cab, because a cab left a record and the subway did not, and walked the last 4 blocks to the coffee place on Lexington, arriving 2 minutes early. Marcus Hale was already there. He was sitting at the corner table with his coat still on and a cup of black coffee going cold in front of him, and the expression of a man who had already run several scenarios and was waiting to find out which one was correct. She sat down. She did not take off her coat. "Tell me what's happening," he said. She told him. She told him cleanly, without embellishment, without the emotional freight she had spent the night compressing down to manageable density. She told him what she'd heard. She told him about Whitmore. She told him about the gala and the inheritance and the trust structure Adrian had apparently built the previous year. She told him that Adrian had apparently spoken to someone about him, about Brennan, which was Marcus's firm, and that there was an angle there that had already been addressed in some way she didn't yet understand. Marcus listened. He did not interrupt. He was a man who had learned long ago that interrupting a client mid-disclosure was how you missed the important parts. When she finished, he was quiet for about 15 seconds. "The trust structure," he said. "He told you that specifically?" "He said it on the phone, last night. He used those words. He said the trust structure we built last year. He said your firm, Brennan, was the complication and that it had been handled." Marcus looked at his coffee. "Brennan is my associate. He handles some of the estate's secondary documentation." He paused. "I was not aware of any communication between Brennan and the Volkov organization." "I know." "If that communication occurred without my knowledge, Marcus," she looked at him directly, "I need to know if the estate documentation is intact. My father's estate, all of it. The primary assets, the trust language, everything." He held her gaze. "I'll know by tonight. I also need to know everything you can find about Gerald Whitmore, professionally, any disciplinary actions, any history of serving as an expert witness in competency proceedings, anything. That I can have by this afternoon. And I need you to know," she said, "that I have not told Adrian I know any of this. He doesn't know I was in that hallway. I need it to stay that way." Marcus nodded slowly. "What are you planning, Elena?" She had thought about how to answer this question. She'd run several versions on the subway. "Right now," she said, "I'm planning to survive the next 3 weeks." He studied her for a moment. "And after that?" She picked up her coffee. It was lukewarm. She drank it anyway. "After that," she said, I'm planning to make sure he doesn't. Marcus paid for the coffee. Elena noticed because he didn't ask, just put the bills on the table and stood, and there was something in the gesture, the quiet assumption of cost, that made her throat tighten in a way she hadn't expected. She swallowed it down before it could become anything. Outside on Lexington, the morning had gotten colder. She pulled her coat closed, and they stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the particular awkwardness of two people who have just exchanged information too serious for a normal goodbye. I'll call you from the office line, Marcus said. Not your cell. I know. Elena. He paused. He was not a man who used first names carelessly, and the weight of it landed. Be careful about what you say to anyone. Anyone. Even people you think are, I know, she said again. He nodded once and walked away. She watched him go, then turned in the opposite direction and walked back toward the hospital with her hands in her pockets and her face arranged and her mind already 3 moves ahead. She had 47 minutes before her first afternoon consult. She used 30 of them to rent a hotel room. Not the same hotel from the previous night. She paid cash at a different place, a business-class property 4 blocks from the hospital, the kind of place where the front desk staff changed every 6 hours and nobody looked up from their screen long enough to register a face. She gave a name that wasn't hers. The name on the credit card she used was her maiden name, Vaughn, on an account she had maintained quietly for 3 years in the low-level, instinctive way that some women maintain exit routes without fully admitting to themselves that's what they're doing. She had never consciously thought, I may need to disappear, but some part of her had thought it. She was starting to understand herself better. She put the key card in her coat pocket and went back to work. The message came at 4:17 in the afternoon while she was washing her hands between consults. It was a text from a number she didn't recognize. No name, no preamble, just 7 words. They have someone watching the house. Be careful. She stood at the sink with water running over her hands and read it twice. Then she turned off the tap, dried her hands, and stood very still for about 10 seconds. She thought about ignoring it. She thought about what it meant if she didn't. She typed back, "Who is this?" The reply took 4 minutes, long enough that she'd almost put the phone away. Someone who also wants him gone. I'll find you when it's time. She stared at that for a long moment. Then she deleted both messages, pocketed her phone, and went back to her consult. She did not tell Marcus about the texts. Not yet. She didn't know what they meant, and she wasn't going to hand someone else an unknown variable until she understood its shape. What she knew was this. Someone inside Adrian's operation, or close enough to it to know about the surveillance, was unhappy enough to reach out to the target. That was information. She filed it. Marcus called at 6:58 from his office line, as promised. The primary trust documents are intact, he said, without greeting. Your father's core estate is structured correctly. The asset language holds. And Brennan? A pause. Brennan met with a man named Kessler 3 months ago. Kessler is a financial structuring consultant whose primary clients include 2 shell corporations that I've traced so far to the Volkov organization. Elena sat down on the edge of the bed in her hotel room. What did Brennan give him? I don't know yet. What I know is that the meeting happened and that Brennan didn't disclose it to me, which is a problem that I'm handling separately. His voice had gone to that very flat register that, in Marcus, meant barely contained fury. What I can tell you is that the meeting occurred before the trust documents were filed, which suggests they were looking for leverage before locking in the structure. That's my read, yes. Can they challenge the estate documents? Not easily. Your father was meticulous, and the primary documentation predates your marriage by a decade. But if they have something Brennan gave them, a procedural gap, a signature irregularity, anything, they could use it to tie up the estate in litigation while the competency proceedings move forward. Elena pressed her free hand against her knee. How long would that litigation take? Years, if they're committed to it. They're committed to it. Then you need to be ahead of this before the gala. 3 weeks is not a lot of time. I know. On Whitmore, Marcus continued, he had a disciplinary review in 2019. Complaint filed by a public defender in a competency case alleged that Whitmore's evaluation was structurally manipulated to serve the prosecution's position. The review board found insufficient evidence to act. The public defender lost the case. The defendant was institutionalized. He paused. The defendant was released 18 months later after an independent evaluation contradicted Whitmore's findings on every major point. He does this for money, Elena said. He does it for money, and because he's been doing it long enough that he's very good at making it look clean. A brief silence. Elena, you understand that challenging a forensic evaluation is not simple, even a fraudulent one. The burden is on you to prove the fraud, not on them to prove the evaluation is legitimate. I know how burden of proof works, Marcus. I know you do. I'm saying it out loud because I need you to understand that we cannot win this in court in 3 weeks, not through standard channels. She was quiet. What are you thinking? He asked. I'm thinking that standard channels are exactly what Adrian has already planned for. Another pause. Longer this time. Be careful, Elena. You keep saying that. I keep meaning it. She thanked him and hung up and sat in the hotel room for a while, watching the light change against the window curtains. Then she ordered food she barely tasted and laid the ultrasound photo on the nightstand and did not let herself look at it until after she'd eaten. When she finally looked at it, she kept her face very still. I know, she said to the comma on the gray screen. I'm working on it. She went home the next morning. She timed it for 7:15, late enough that Adrian would be awake and in his routine, early enough that she could claim she'd gotten in at 6 from the hospital and hadn't wanted to wake him. She had practiced the explanation enough times that it sat in her chest without any apparent weight. He was in the kitchen when she came in, standing at the counter with his back to the door and a cup of coffee in his hand, reading something on his phone. She knew this posture. She had known it for 6 years. The particular set of his shoulders, the slight tilt of his head. He was a physically precise man. Everything he did had a kind of deliberate economy to it, as if he'd calculated the minimum necessary expenditure for every movement. You should have called, he said, without turning around. I didn't want to wake you. It ran long. It always runs long. He turned then and looked at her, and the thing she noticed first, before the usual calculation of whether he believed her, was that he was watching her face with an attention that was maybe half a degree more careful than usual. He knew she hadn't been home, or he suspected, or someone who'd been watching the house had told him she'd left and hadn't returned, and he was waiting to see what she offered. She did not offer anything. She pulled off her coat and hung it and crossed to the coffee machine and said, Did you eat? I can make something before I go back in. I'm fine. She got her coffee. She felt his eyes on her back. The gala committee called, Adrian said. They want to confirm your dress order. Her hand did not tighten on the mug. She was very careful about that. I'll call them today. 3 weeks? I know. She turned around and looked at him. He was watching her with that precise, assessing look, and she looked back with a face that she had been arranging for 36 hours, and for a moment they were just 2 people standing in a kitchen 8 feet apart, and the space between them was filled with everything neither of them was saying. You look tired, he said. I am tired. You should sleep. I have consults at 9. He nodded. He put his phone in his pocket. He came close enough that she could smell his aftershave, which she had once found comforting and which now registered as threat data, and he put his hand against her jaw briefly and looked at her face. Don't run yourself into the ground. I won't, she said. He held her gaze for 1 beat too long. Then he dropped his hand and picked up his coffee and left the kitchen. Elena stood at the counter and let out a breath that she had not noticed she was holding. Her jaw, where his hand had been, felt like a place she needed to disinfect. Gregor Maurice found her, or rather, he let himself be found, which, she would understand later, was the more accurate description. She had spent 5 days building the perimeter of her double life with the meticulous care she brought to a difficult surgery, every step documented, every movement considered. She had established her secondary hotel room as a working space. She had begun photographing documents, financial statements she'd quietly accumulated from the household accounts over the previous years, records she'd had nominal access to as Adrian's wife, but had never examined with any rigor. She had begun to understand, looking at them now, how deliberately obscured the picture was. Shell company names, transfer destinations that looped back on themselves, payments classified as consulting fees to entities that, when she searched them, resolved into nothing. She had also started noticing the man. He was outside the hospital twice, once near the coffee cart, once across the street on the opposite sidewalk. Medium height, maybe late 50s, wearing a coat that was slightly wrong for the weather. Too heavy for the temperature, but too plain to be deliberate warmth. He was not looking at her. He was very conspicuously not looking at her, which was its own kind of looking. On the third sighting, a Tuesday, outside the hotel she'd been using to work from, she stopped walking and turned and looked directly at him. He met her eyes. He didn't move. She walked toward him. He waited. That was the part she noticed later. Another man might have walked away, might have made her chase or pretend she'd imagined it. He waited. "You texted me," she said, when she was close enough to speak without raising her voice. "I did." "Who are you?" "Someone who has 8 ledgers and nowhere safe to put them." She looked at him. He was older than she'd estimated from a distance, and there was a particular quality to the way he held himself, carefully, with the kind of physical awareness of space that she associated with people who had spent time in environments where the wrong posture could end badly. "Whose ledgers?" she asked. "Your husband's organization. 6 years of accounts." He held her gaze. "Money laundering, bribery payments, judicial interference, names." A brief pause. "Amounts." Elena breathed in slowly through her nose. "Where did you get them?" "I kept them. I was the logistics chief for 4 years. When I left..." He stopped. Leaving wasn't simple. "Why come to me?" He looked at her steadily. "Because I've been watching this situation for 3 months, and you're the only person in his immediate circle who he's actively working to destroy, which means you're the only person with a direct reason to use what I have." A beat. "And because you walked out of that hospital at 11 at night last month carrying the same patient load as 3 residents, and you didn't complain once. I've been watching a lot of people. You're not like the others." She wasn't sure what to do with that. She let it sit. "What do you want?" she asked. "Immunity. A new name. A place outside the country where no one knows where I went." He said it simply, without drama, like a man who had rehearsed it often enough to have removed all the pleading from it. She studied him. "I'm a surgeon. I can't give you any of that." "No," he said, "but if you take the ledgers to the right people, they can." The sidewalk moved around them. A cab went past. Someone's phone played a tinny fragment of music 3 feet away and then faded. "How do I know the ledgers are real?" she asked. He reached into his coat and produced a single folded page. 1 page, handwritten, in a tight and precise script. He held it out. She took it, unfolded it, and read. Names, dates, amounts. 2 judges she recognized from professional charity circuits. A state senator she'd shaken hands with at a hospital benefit. A financial transfer that corresponded almost exactly to a period when Adrian had mentioned a real estate deal she'd never fully understood the structure of. Her hand stayed steady. "When can I see the rest?" she asked. "When I know you're serious." "I'm standing in front of you." "Standing in front of me is easy." He looked at her without challenge, just assessment. "When you're ready to do something that costs you something, you'll know where to find me." He gave her a number, a different one from the text. He told her to call from a phone that wasn't registered to her name. Then he turned and walked away. She stood on the sidewalk with the single page still in her hand and watched him disappear into the ordinary flow of the street. She had 2.5 weeks until the gala. The argument happened on a Thursday, 9 days before the event, and it was the kind of argument that happens when one person knows the truth and the other doesn't know they know, and the pressure of maintaining that gap has become physically uncomfortable. It started about dinner. Of all things. Adrian had invited 3 people without telling her. Associates, he said, business. She'd come home at 7:30 to find a housekeeper she hadn't seen before setting the table for 6, and Adrian in the doorway of his study telling her that Dominic and the others would be there at 8, and it would be good if she could be ready by then. She looked at the housekeeper. She looked at Adrian. "The regular staff?" she asked, evenly. "Maria had a family thing. I called an agency." "You called an agency for a dinner I didn't know we were having." Something moved through his expression. Not guilt. Adrian didn't do guilt the way most people did. It was more like an adjustment, a recalibration. I should have texted you. It was a late decision. She crossed her arms. She did it because her hands needed somewhere to go, and because a woman who didn't know anything would have some normal irritation about this. And she needed to look like a woman who didn't know anything. Who's Dominic? Investment group. I've been working with them on a project. What project? Elena. His voice dropped a register. Not threatening, just quieter. The way he got when he wanted to redirect without appearing to redirect. It's a boring dinner. I need your face there, not your opinion on the organizational structure. She looked at him for a moment. Fine, she said. I need 45 minutes. She went upstairs and changed and sat on the edge of the bathroom counter for 6 of those 45 minutes staring at her own face in the mirror. She pressed her fingers against her sternum. She breathed. Then she put on earrings and went back downstairs and was perfectly charming for 2.5 hours, while Adrian's associates talked about property development and tax structures. And she absorbed everything she could and smiled and asked just enough questions to seem engaged rather than investigative. One of them, a man named Carver, watched her with a specific attention. Not the way men usually watched her. Something else. Something more deliberate. She smiled at him, and he looked away first. After they left, after the strange housekeeper had cleaned up and gone, after the house had gone quiet, Elena was at the kitchen sink rinsing the last glasses, and Adrian was standing in the doorway, and she felt him watching her before he spoke. You were quiet tonight, he said. I'm tired. You're always tired. She turned the water off. I'm a surgeon, Adrian. Tired is the baseline. Carver asked about you afterward. She turned around. What did he ask? He said you seemed different from how he'd heard you described. Adrian's voice was level. His face was level. Everything about him was, as always, precisely level. He said you seemed sharp. She held his gaze. Is that a problem? No, Adrian said. Just interesting. She dried her hands and folded the towel and set it on the counter and walked past him toward the stairs without touching him. Elena. She stopped. I worry about you, he said. The hours, the stress. I've been thinking about asking Whitmore. Do you know him? The psychiatrist? I've heard he does excellent work with physicians who are burning out. The back of her neck went cold. She didn't turn around. She took one breath, measured, and then she turned around and looked at him with the face she had been building for 9 days. Steady, slightly puzzled, carrying nothing. I'm not burning out, she said. It's not a weakness to ask for help. I know that. She allowed a small frown. Concern, not alarm. Adrian, I'm fine. You don't need to arrange a psychiatrist. He looked at her for a long moment. In his expression, behind the careful concern, she could see the math happening, the calculation of whether her reaction was normal, whether she'd taken the bait too cleanly or not cleanly enough. This was what 6 years of marriage to this man had given her, the ability to read the math. All right, he said, just think about it. She went upstairs. She sat on the bathroom floor for about 4 minutes because her legs had gone strange. Then she stood up and washed her face and opened a small notebook she kept behind a loose trim panel under the sink and wrote down everything she'd heard at dinner and the names of Adrian's associates and the name Carver and the fact that Adrian had mentioned Whitmore directly to her face with an expression that had looked like concern and wasn't. He was testing her. She didn't know what he'd concluded. She had 12 days. She called Gregor from a prepaid phone she'd purchased with cash on Monday. I'm ready, she said when he picked up. The ledgers? All of them, tomorrow. A pause. You said something that costs you something. I know. She looked at her own face in the mirror above the sink. I made an appointment for tonight. With who? She had spent 6 days finding the name. Cross-referencing cases, public records, professional histories, the specific pattern of prosecutions that pointed to an agent who operated with surgical precision in organized crime investigations, and who had, 3 years ago, been involved in a financial case that had obliquely touched the outer edge of the Volkov network without ever finding its way inside. FBI, she said, Special Agent Carla Reyes. The silence on Gregor's end lasted long enough that she thought he might have gone. You understand what that means, he said finally. Once you walk in, I know what it means. There's no... Gregor. She said his name the way she said a patient's name when they needed to stop arguing and start listening. I have 12 days and a forged psychiatric file and a husband who just said the psychiatrist's name to my face like he was doing me a favor. Her voice didn't shake. I know what it means. Another long pause. The ledgers will be in a locker at Penn Station, he said. Blue bag. I'll text you the number. Thank you. Don't thank me. Just don't get us both killed. She hung up and looked at herself in the mirror for a long moment, the hollow under her eyes, the set of her jaw, the face of someone who had run out of options that felt safe and was now choosing the one that didn't. She pressed her hand flat against her abdomen, the way she'd been doing it every night, the private accounting of it, still here, still real. Okay, she said quietly, not to anyone, just to the decision she had already made and was now fully inhabiting. Okay. She put the notebook back behind the trim panel. She put the prepaid phone in her coat pocket. She picked up her keys. She had an appointment to keep. The FBI field office wasn't where she'd expected it to be. Reyes had given her an address over a brief, clipped phone call that lasted under 3 minutes. A building in Midtown that looked, from the outside, like a mid-tier accounting firm, which Elena suspected was entirely the point. She arrived 7 minutes early and waited on the sidewalk in the cold because she needed the 7 minutes to be outside rather than inside, to feel the air on her face and let her heart rate do whatever it was going to do before she walked through a door she couldn't walk back through. It was doing quite a lot. She went in anyway. Reyes was waiting in a room with no windows and a table that had 3 coffee rings on it and 2 chairs on either side and a recording device that Reyes turned on without asking, which Elena had expected. The agent was younger than she'd imagined from the case records, mid-40s at most, with a compact, self-contained quality about her, the look of someone who had learned to take up exactly as much space as necessary and no more. Her suit was good but not expensive. Her eyes were very still. Dr. Vaughn, she said, sit down. Elena sat. She put her bag on the floor beside her chair. She folded her hands on the table. Start wherever makes sense, Reyes said. Elena started at the hallway. She went through it the same way she'd gone through it with Marcus, clean, sequential, no embellishment, but this time she kept going past where she'd stopped with Marcus. She told Reyes about Gregor, about the ledgers, about the text message from the unknown number, which she now believed had come from Gregor as a preliminary contact before he'd established the in-person meeting. She told her about Whitmore, about Carver, about Adrian saying the psychiatrist's name to her face in their kitchen with an expression calibrated to look like concern. She put the single page Gregor had given her on the table. Reyes looked at it without touching it for a moment. Then she put on gloves. She had them in her jacket pocket, which meant she'd expected documentation, and picked it up and read it. She read it twice. The ledgers, she said. Where are they now? Penn Station, storage locker. I have the number. You haven't retrieved them yet. No, I wanted to establish this conversation first. Reyes looked up from the page. Smart. Or paranoid. In your situation, they're the same thing. Reyes set the page down and looked at her steadily. What do you want from this, Dr. Vaughn? My child's safety. My medical license. My freedom. Elena kept her voice level. Evidence against my husband that is gathered legally through the appropriate federal mechanisms and that cannot be challenged on procedural grounds by any attorney he hires. And your inheritance. That too. Reyes nodded. Not judgment, just accounting. You understand that cooperating with an ongoing investigation means we dictate the timeline. I understand that. If we move too early, we lose the bigger targets. If your husband gets any indication that you've been in contact with us, he won't. Elena met her eyes. Not from my end. Reyes studied her for a moment. There was a quality to her attention that reminded Elena of the way experienced attendings looked at complicated scans, not looking for what they expected to find, looking for what they hadn't thought to expect. The gala, Reyes said. 3 weeks. 11 days now. That's not a lot of time to build a clean operation. No, Elena said. It isn't. Another pause. Reyes leaned back in her chair and looked at the ceiling briefly, and then looked back down. Tell me about the other faction. Elena's hand, still folded on the table, went slightly still. What other faction? The text. You said you believed it came from Gregor as preliminary contact. I'm not sure you're right about that. Reyes kept her voice neutral. We've had eyes on the Volkov organization for 14 months. There's a secondary group, competing interests, overlapping territories, that has been monitoring Volkov's domestic situation for a while. They have reason to want him destabilized. A beat. They also have reason to want his evidence buried. Elena felt something cold move through her chest. You think the text came from them? I think it's possible. And Gregor? Gregor Maris. Yes, we know who he is. Reyes said it without emphasis, which was its own kind of emphasis. He left the organization 2 years ago, not one. He's been in contact with a third party we've been tracking for about 8 months. She paused. Dr. Vaughn, I need you to consider the possibility that the man with the ledgers is not simply a whistleblower who wants immunity. The room was very quiet. Elena could hear the slight hum of the ventilation system. What is he? She asked. We don't know yet. That's the honest answer. Reyes held her gaze. What I know is that the ledgers exist. We have corroborating evidence for several of the transactions on this page, and that someone worked very hard to ensure they found their way to you specifically. Elena looked at the table. She looked at her own hands. She thought about the sidewalk, Gregor waiting, the quality of patience and how he'd held himself, the specificity of what he'd told her, the fact that he'd known about the surveillance on the house. He said he'd been watching me for 3 months, she said. He probably has. He said I was the only person in Adrian's circle with reason to use the evidence. That's true, Reyes said. And it's also the exact thing you'd say to someone if you wanted them to trust you. Elena was quiet for a long time. Reyes let her be quiet. What do you want me to do? Elena finally asked. Keep the appointment with the locker. Retrieve the ledgers. Bring them here. Reyes leaned forward slightly. Don't tell Gregor you've spoken to us. He'll assume I have. Maybe, but assumption and confirmation are different things, and right now that gap is useful to us. Reyes paused. Can you do that? Elena looked at her. I've been doing harder things than that for 11 days. For the first time, Reyes's expression shifted slightly. Not quite a smile, something adjacent to respect. 11 days from now, if this holds together, your husband and everyone in that ballroom will wish they'd paid more attention to you. They always wish that, Elena said, afterward. She picked up her bag. She stood. Reyes stood too. Dr. Vaughn. Reyes held out a card, plain, with only a number. Any contact comes through this, not email, not text through your regular phone. You buy prepaid, you call, you hang up when you're done. Elena took the card. I know how this works. You know how surgery works. This is different. Is it? Elena put the card in her coat pocket. In surgery, you're operating in a hostile environment with incomplete information, and every mistake is permanent. She looked at Reyes steadily. I've been doing that since I was 26. She walked out. The locker at Penn Station was number 47, in a bank of them on the lower level near the Long Island Railroad gates. She went at 11 the next morning, peak commuter flow, surrounded by the ordinary noise of 1,000 people going somewhere. The blue bag was there. It was heavier than she'd expected. She took it without stopping to look inside, transferred it into the larger tote she'd brought for that purpose, and walked to the uptown subway and took it straight to a second location. Not the FBI building, not her hotel, but a third space she'd rented for exactly this purpose. A small self-storage unit on the west side that she'd paid 3 months in advance for under her maiden name with cash she'd been quietly accumulating in small withdrawals over 2 weeks. She photographed every page of every ledger before she touched anything else. It took 3 hours. Her hands were steady for the first 2 and started showing the tremor of sustained concentration in the third, the way they sometimes did in a very long surgery, and she stopped twice to shake them out and breathe and continue. 8 ledgers. 6 years of accounts. Hundreds of pages in Gregor's tight, precise handwriting. She had read enough financial documentation in her professional life, hospital budgets, estate documents, the dense architecture of her father's business interests, to understand what she was looking at, not the technical details of criminal financial structuring, but the shape of it. The repetition of certain names, the patterns. 2 appeals court judges, a deputy mayor, 4 city council members, a federal prosecutor, a name she had to read twice because she recognized it from news coverage of high-profile cases over the past 3 years. 3 major investment banks, not as institutions, but as specific individuals within those institutions. Payments listed by date, amount, and a 3-letter code she didn't understand, but which appeared consistently enough that she photographed every instance separately. And Whitmore. Page 11 of Ledger 3. Dr. Gerald Whitmore. 12 payments over 14 months, each one listed under the code MED/CPT and ranging in amount from $8,000 to $35,000. She photographed that page 4 times from different angles. She sent the encrypted photographs to 2 places, a cloud account under her maiden name that Marcus knew how to access, and a secure server address that Reyes had given her. Then she put the ledgers back in the blue bag and put the blue bag in the storage unit and locked it. She walked outside into the afternoon and stood on the sidewalk and let herself feel, for about 90 seconds, the full weight of what she was holding. The names in those ledgers were not abstractions. They were real people with careers and families and public reputations built over decades. Some of them might have been coerced. Some of them had certainly not been. She was not naive enough to sort them into innocent and guilty from a storage unit in Hell's Kitchen. That wasn't her job. Her job was to survive the next 10 days. She went back to the hospital. Sonia called on a Friday. Elena saw the name on her phone screen and stood in the corridor outside her office for a moment, the phone face up in her hand, and watched it ring. 3 times. 4. She answered. L. Sonia's voice was the same as it had always been, warm, slightly husky, the voice of a woman who laughed often. I've been trying to reach you. Are you all right? You've been so quiet. I've been busy, Elena said. Her voice came out normal. She was obscurely proud of that. I know, but... A small pause. I ran into Adrian last week. He mentioned you've been under a lot of pressure. He seemed worried. Elena looked at the wall in front of her. There was a framed patient satisfaction survey result hanging there, 94% positive, and she looked at it without seeing it. He mentioned that to you. He called me, actually, just to check in. He knows we're close, and he called you. A beat. Yes. Is that... When? Wednesday. Sonia's voice had shifted slightly. The warmth was still there, but something else had moved in under it. Uncertainty. Or the very good imitation of uncertainty. Elle, you're scaring me. What's going on? Elena breathed in through her nose. What she wanted to do was not possible in a hospital corridor on a Friday afternoon. What she wanted to do was ask Sonia, very directly, how long it had been going on, and whether those 15 years had meant anything, and whether Sonia had been in that study with Adrian, not on the phone but in the room, physically, and whether the plan to destroy Elena had been something they'd built together over dinner or something Adrian had simply reported to her as progress. She wanted to ask. She didn't. I'm fine, she said. I'm just tired. Surgery schedule is brutal. Okay. Sonia didn't sound convinced, but she also didn't push. Let's have dinner next week. I feel like I haven't actually seen you in... I'll look at my schedule, Elena said. I have to go. I have a consult. She hung up. She stood in the corridor for another moment, phone in her hand, and let the feeling move through her. Not the grief. She wasn't there yet. Grief required a kind of stillness she couldn't afford right now. But the specific nausea of understanding that the warmth in Sonia's voice had been real and had also been false, and that both things were simultaneously true, and that some part of her had loved a version of Sonia that may never have completely existed. She put the phone in her pocket. She went to her consult. The threat arrived on the 8th day before the gala. It arrived not as a threat, not overtly, but as a visit from a man named Prater, who appeared in her hospital waiting area at 2 in the afternoon claiming to be a patient's family member, but who did not have a patient's name when she asked, and who, when she came out to speak to him herself because her assistant had flagged something was wrong, handed her a sealed envelope and said, "From a mutual friend," and left before she could respond. Inside the envelope was a photograph. Her, outside the FBI building in Midtown. The angle suggested a camera on the opposite side of the street, or from a vehicle. The timestamp in the corner read the night of her first meeting with Reyes. Behind the photograph was a single typed line. "We know. Walk away from what you found, and you both walk away." She stood in the waiting area with the photograph in her hand and the envelope and the single typed line, and she understood several things simultaneously. First, the competing faction Reyes had warned her about had surveillance on the FBI field office. Or on her. Possibly both. Second, they knew about the meeting, but the message said, "Walk away from what you found," which meant they were focused on the ledgers, which meant this was not Adrian's people, because Adrian didn't yet know she knew anything. And if this had come from him, the message would have been different, more personal, more precise. Third, you both meant her and her child. They knew. Someone had found out about the pregnancy. She didn't know how. She was aware that her hands had gone cold. She was aware of the waiting room around her, a woman in her 60s reading a magazine, a man in his 40s staring at his phone, a child asleep across two chairs with her head on her mother's lap. All of them existing in perfect ordinariness 8 feet away. She put the photograph and the note back in the envelope. She put the envelope in her bag. She walked to the staff bathroom and locked the door and sat on the closed toilet lid and put her head in her hands. Not for long. She didn't have long. She thought, Reyes needs to know now. She thought, if I call Reyes now and this faction has the FBI building under surveillance, the call itself becomes a variable. She thought, I have 8 days and my cover may already be partially blown, and there is a photograph of me walking into a federal building and someone who knows I'm pregnant. She had walked into Reyes's office thinking she was the one with leverage. She thought about Gregor, the patient quality of his waiting, the precision of the information he'd given her. Reyes's warning, he might not be what he appeared. She thought about the ledgers in the storage unit and the encrypted photographs and the 12 payments to Whitmore and the deputy mayor's name on page after page. She thought about Adrian in the kitchen saying, I worry about you with his hand against her jaw. She sat in the bathroom for 4 minutes. Then she stood up and flushed the toilet for the sake of anyone listening and ran the tap and looked at herself in the mirror. The face looking back at her was someone she recognized, but only just. She called Reyes from the prepaid phone in her coat pocket, standing in a supply closet 2 floors up, where the ventilation noise would mask her voice. I got a photograph, she said when Reyes picked up. Someone has surveillance on your building or on me. They know I met with you. They're using the pregnancy as leverage. A silence on Reyes's end. Brief but specific. When did you receive it? 20 minutes ago. Courier. Hospital waiting room. What does the message say? Elena read it. Another silence. All right. Reyes's voice had gone to its flattest register. This is the secondary faction. We've been tracking a separate approach to you for the last week. I should have told you sooner. Yes, Elena said. You should have. Dr. Vaughn. Don't. Her voice came out harder than she'd intended. Don't explain the operational decision. Just tell me what I'm actually walking into. A pause. The secondary faction wants the ledgers because 3 pages of Ledger 7 document their own financial exposure inside the Volkov network. They can't let those pages reach us. Elena's grip tightened on the phone. Gregor gave me all 8 ledgers. Yes. Including Ledger 7. Yes. He knew what was in it. Almost certainly. She stood very still in the supply closet with medical gauze on the shelf 6 inches from her face and a blood pressure cuff hanging from a hook, and the sounds of the hospital operating normally on the other side of the door, and she thought about a man on a sidewalk who had waited for her with the specific patience of someone executing a plan. He set me up to take the evidence to you, she said, and he knew that would expose the secondary faction, and he knew they would come after me, and he wanted... She stopped. He wanted them exposed, Reyes said. The ledgers are leverage over both organizations. Gregor played both sides. And I'm the one holding the ledgers. Yes. In a building under my maiden name. We need to move them, Reyes said. Tonight, can you get there? Yes. And Dr. Vaughn, the gala, we're still committed to the operation, but you need to understand the risk profile has changed. Elena laughed. It came out short and without any humor whatsoever. Has it? Two factions, both with surveillance capability, both with reason to want you neutralized before the event. So instead of one person trying to destroy me, Elena said, I now have three. She could hear Reyes breathing on the other end. What do you want to do? Reyes asked. Elena looked at the blood pressure cuff on the hook. She thought about a thumbnail heartbeat on a gray screen. She thought about 8 ledgers in a blue bag and a photograph with a timestamp and a man named Gregor, who had handed her a weapon and neglected to mention it was also a target. She thought about Adrian's hand on her jaw, gentle as a threat. I want to go to the gala, she said. Elena. I want to go to the gala as his wife. I want to be in that room when every one of those people realizes what's happening. Her voice was steady. It surprised her how steady it was. I spent 6 years in that marriage being the person no one paid enough attention to. I'm going to use that one last time. That's not a small ask. No, she agreed. But here's what I know. You need me in that room because I know the faces and the names and who's connected to whom in ways that your surveillance doesn't. And I need you in that building because I am 8 weeks pregnant and alone, and I have 2 criminal organizations and a corrupt psychiatrist and my own husband positioned against me. She paused. So, we need each other, which means I'm not walking away from this. A long silence. I need something from you first, Reyes said, before we move forward. Full disclosure, everything you haven't told me yet. Elena closed her eyes for 1 second. There was one thing she hadn't told Reyes, one piece she'd held back, not out of strategy exactly, but out of the instinct that some information was safer close to the chest until she understood it better. The 3-letter code in the ledgers, MED/CPT. She'd photographed every instance, but she hadn't decoded it. She'd been too focused on the other names, the other amounts. Now, standing in a supply closet with the walls closing in, she understood that she needed to know what it meant before she handed everything to Reyes. Because if MED/CPT meant what she was beginning to suspect it meant, if the payments to Whitmore were not just about her, not just about one forged competency evaluation, but about a system, a practiced mechanism for neutralizing specific people, then the list of names attached to that code was going to be longer than Gerald Whitmore. And some of those names might be people Reyes already knew. She opened her eyes. I need 48 hours, she said. The 48 hours she'd asked for almost killed her. Not literally, but close enough that the distinction felt academic by the end of it. She started with the code, MED/CPT. She'd been turning it over in her mind since she'd first seen it in Ledger 3, and she'd been avoiding the most obvious interpretation because the most obvious interpretation was also the most catastrophic. MED for medical, CPT for competency. A billing shorthand, the kind a man like Whitmore would use if he wanted his ledger entries to look, at a casual glance, like legitimate professional fees. She pulled every instance she'd photographed, 14 payments across 3 ledgers spanning 4 years. Whitmore's name appeared explicitly in 6 of them. The others had only the code and a recipient listed as a numbered account. She spent the first night cross-referencing the dates against public records, competency proceedings, civil commitment orders, guardianship filings, anything that was accessible through the legal databases she had access to through the hospital's research library. Her login was legitimate. She used it from a terminal in the hospital library at 2 in the morning when the building was as close to empty as it ever got. 4 of the payment dates matched, within a 2-week window, to competency proceedings that had been filed in New York County Civil Court against individuals whose names she recognized from the ledgers as people who had stopped appearing in Adrian's financial records around the same time. Business associates, former partners. One name she didn't recognize from the ledgers at all, which was the one that disturbed her most because it meant Whitmore's services had been used against someone outside Adrian's direct network, either on contract for someone else or as a standalone operation. She photographed her notes. She sent them encrypted to Marcus's access point and to a draft email account she shared only with Reyes, where they communicated by leaving draft messages neither of them sent. At 4 in the morning, she ordered bad coffee from the hospital vending machine and sat in the stairwell on the 3rd floor and let herself think about what this meant. Whitmore was not just a weapon built for her specifically. He was infrastructure, a tool that had been deployed at least 4 times before, possibly more, against people who had inconvenienced the organization. Her destruction was not personal. It was procedural. That was almost worse. She went home at 6 and slept for 2 hours and woke up with her coat still on. The second day was Reyes. She went to the secondary meat location Reyes had established, a laundromat in the 20s where 2 machines were always out of order, and the security camera over the door had been broken for 3 months, and sat in a plastic chair with her coat in her lap and waited. Reyes came in at 11 sharp wearing civilian clothes and carrying a bag of laundry that Elena was fairly certain contained nothing requiring washing. She sat down beside Elena and looked at the wall. "Talk," Reyes said. Elena talked. She laid out the MED/CPT analysis, the 4 precedent cases, the unnamed recipient. She kept her voice flat and her hands still, and she watched Reyes's face out of the corner of her eye. Reyes's face did almost nothing, but at the unnamed recipient her jaw shifted slightly, a 1/4 inch of movement, a tell so small that Elena would have missed it 2 weeks ago. "You know that name?" Elena said. Reyes was quiet. "Reyes. The unnamed recipient in the ledgers is a woman named Patricia Halve," Reyes said. "She was a forensic accountant. She was building a case against the Volkov network 2 years ago, independent of federal involvement. She was committed to a psychiatric facility in New Jersey 14 months ago following a competency evaluation performed by Gerald Whitmore." She paused. "She's still there." Elena's stomach dropped. "She's still in the facility," Elena said. "The commitment order was obtained through a judge who appears in Ledger 2. "You already knew." "We knew about Halve. We didn't have the documentation connecting Whitmore to the payment structure until you found it in the ledgers." Reyes turned to look at her directly. "Dr. Vaughn, what you have in that storage unit is not just evidence against your husband. You have documentation of a judicial corruption ring that has been operating for 6 years, and that has, so far, successfully institutionalized at least 1 federal witness and bankrupted 3 others." Elena pressed her back against the plastic chair. The chair was cold and slightly sticky, and the laundromat smelled like dryer sheets and industrial detergent, and she sat in it and held the shape of what Reyes had just said inside her chest and felt it expand to fill the available space. "If I hadn't heard him on that phone," she said, "someone else would have found it eventually." "Have found it." "Yes." "And now she's in a facility in New Jersey." Reyes held her gaze. "We're working on getting her out. Quietly. It requires establishing the fraudulent basis of the evaluation first, which requires Whitmore's payment records, which are in my storage unit." "Yes." Elena looked at the broken washing machine across from her. Someone had scratched words into the metal panel, but she couldn't read them from this angle. "The gala," she said. 6 days. "Is the operation sanctioned?" "At the level it needs to be, yes. It took the Patricia Halve documentation to push it through. What you found accelerated our timeline by about 4 months." "I need to know the full plan," Elena said. "Not the outline, the specifics. Who's positioned where, what my signal is. What happens if something goes wrong before I can get to the stage?" Reyes pulled a folded paper from her laundry bag. She held it out. Elena took it and read it. It was a layout. The estate where the gala was held, a property in Westchester that Adrienne used annually. Entry points, agent positions, communication protocols. Her role, outlined in the kind of terse, direct language that left no room for misinterpretation. She was going in wired, a device small enough to fit inside the underwire of a formal dress. She would have 1 earpiece, single use, to receive from Reyes if the communication was critical. Otherwise, she would move independently. She would have a 40-minute window between her arrival and the point at which Adrian planned to make his announcement, a window Reyes had calculated based on surveillance of the 2 previous galas, their timing and structure. 40 minutes to identify and document the faces in that room, to confirm which of the ledger names were physically present, to position herself at the microphone before Adrian reached it. If anything went wrong in those 40 minutes, if Adrian moved early, if the secondary faction made contact, if her cover was blown, she had a single word to say into the wire. The word was Halve. "After that," Reyes said, "we come in. But Dr. Vaughn said... She paused. After that, you're in a room with approximately 60 people, some of whom will be armed, some of whom will panic, and some of whom will be specifically motivated to prevent you from reaching that microphone. I know. Adrian will know immediately what's happening. I know. He will try to reach you. Elena folded the paper and handed it back. Let him try. She told Adrian she'd had the dress altered. It was the only explanation for why she needed to go to a fitting 3 days before the gala, and it was plausible because the dress, the one she'd worn to previous year's events, had required alterations before, and Adrian did not track her schedule with enough granularity to know that she hadn't actually scheduled a fitting. She went instead to a safe house in Brooklyn where a woman Reyes had sent was waiting with the wire device and 45 minutes of technical instruction that Elena absorbed with the focused attention she gave to learning new surgical equipment. The device was smaller than she'd expected. The woman, she didn't give her name and Elena didn't ask, showed her how to position it, how to activate it, how to kill it, if she needed to kill it. The activation is passive once it's on, the woman said. You don't have to do anything, but if you need to abort, I won't need to abort. The woman looked at her. You should still know how. Fine. Show me. She showed her. Elena memorized it. She also memorized the layout from the paper Reyes had shown her, the exit points, the position of the kitchen entrance that opened to the east side of the estate grounds where 2 agents would be stationed. She had been to this property twice before. She had walked its rooms, stood in its garden, made conversation in its ballroom. She knew where the back staircase was, and that it led out near the library, and that the library had a connecting door to the estate's archive room that Adrian used as an office during events. She knew because she'd been in that archive room 3 years ago, looking for a pen. She had found one, and she'd also seen, briefly, a shelf of ledgers that she'd registered with the vague peripheral awareness of a person whose attention was elsewhere, and then promptly forgotten. She hadn't thought about them again until now. She drove home from Brooklyn. She parked a block from the house and sat in the car for a moment. She had 6 days. Gregor called her 2 days before the gala, not on the prepaid, on her regular phone. She stared at the number, unknown, but the same structure as the first text he'd sent her, and felt a specific cold clarity drop over her. She answered. You went to the bureau, he said. No greeting. His voice was different on the phone, harder. You knew I would. I hoped you would. There's a difference. A pause. What did they tell you about me? Elena was standing in the hospital parking structure, 3 levels up, in a corner with no cameras. She'd started mapping the camera positions in every building she regularly entered, which was either strategic or a sign that her relationship with ordinary life had fundamentally changed. Possibly both. They told me you played both sides, she said, that you wanted the secondary faction exposed along with Adrian. That's accurate. You used me to carry the evidence. I used you because you were going to move against him anyway, and you needed what I had. That's not the same as using you. Gregor, I didn't lie to you about the ledgers. Every page is real, every amount, every name, every transaction. His voice was flat and certain. The secondary faction wants those pages gone because they expose them. I want them exposed because they've been operating inside the network for 6 years, and they're more dangerous than Adrian, not less. Why didn't you just go to the FBI yourself? Because they were watching me, closely. I moved toward federal contact. I'm dead before I make the call. You had access that I didn't. You had proximity. You had motive that was clean. A pause. You had the kind of face that makes people underestimate you. She didn't respond. Dr. Vaughn, his voice changed slightly. The hardness dropped a register, not to warmth exactly, but to something more direct. The secondary faction knows you're going to the gala. They knew before I did. They have someone inside the event. Her chest tightened. Who? I don't know the name. I know the role. Catering staff, possibly. Or security. He paused. I'm telling you because whoever sent that photograph to your hospital is not going to stop at photographs. Are you going to be there? A silence. No. My part ends when you walk through those doors. Another pause. But I need you to get those ledgers into federal hands cleanly, because that immunity agreement depends on this going right. If you go down, the ledgers become contested evidence and everything falls apart. And Patricia Halve stays in that facility. A brief silence. You found her. Reyes found her. The ledgers connected it. He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was different. Halve was good at her job. She got too close. I know how that feels. Yeah. He exhaled. 2 days. 2 days. Don't go in there trying to be a surgeon, he said. In that room, you're the only thing standing between about 40 years of collective prison sentences and the door. They will do anything. I know. Do you? She thought about the photograph with the timestamp. She thought about the word you both. I know, she said again. He hung up. Tumt. The night before the gala, Adrian came to bed at a normal hour for the first time in weeks. She was already there reading, or pretending to read. The words had been moving across her vision without landing for 20 minutes. When he came in and went through his routine and got into bed beside her with the naturalness of a man who had no reason to perform normalcy because as far as he knew, nothing was wrong. She could feel the warmth of him 2 feet away. She thought, I have slept beside this person for 6 years. I have woken up next to him and eaten breakfast next to him and watched him sick and watched him in the particular vulnerability of deep sleep, and I have believed, for most of it, that what we had was imperfect but real. She turned a page she hadn't read. You seem calm, he said. I'm tired. You're always tired. But he said it differently than usual, not the deflective version, something more careful. She looked at him. He was watching the ceiling. Looking forward to tomorrow? She asked. A pause. It's always a good event. She looked back at her book. I had the dress pressed. It should be ready by 6. Good. Another silence. The particular quality of silence between two people who are not saying what they're thinking. Elena. He didn't move. Didn't turn his head. Are you happy? She turned another unread page. The question sat in the space between them with all its hidden architecture, all the things it was and was not asking. I'm where I need to be, she said. He seemed to accept that, or to accept it enough. He turned off his lamp. She kept reading for another 20 minutes until his breathing changed, and then she turned off her own lamp and lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and listened to him sleep. She thought, tomorrow night, this is over. One way or another. She put her hand on her abdomen in the dark, the way she'd been doing every night, the quiet accounting of it. Still there, she breathed. Barb. The gala was everything it always was. The Westchester estate lit up like a statement, every window blazing, the drive lined with cars that each cost more than most people's annual salary. Elena arrived with Adrian at 7:45 in the black car he'd sent, wearing the dress she'd worn 2 years ago because she'd told him the new one wasn't ready, and he'd looked at her and said nothing, which either meant he believed her or was choosing not to push it. She was wired under the dress. The device was cold against her skin for the first 10 minutes, and then she stopped noticing it. She worked the room. That was the right word for it. Worked. Because what she was doing required the same kind of focused, methodical execution as a complicated procedure. She moved through the crowd with the ease of a woman who had done this many times, which she had, and she smiled and spoke and touched arms and accepted glasses of champagne she didn't drink and looked carefully at every face. She was mapping. The deputy mayor, near the east windows. 2 of the judges from the ledgers. Together, which she hadn't expected. They'd apparently known each other well enough to arrive as a pair. The federal prosecutor standing alone at the bar, which struck her as the loneliest thing she'd seen all night. Carver, the man from the dinner 2 weeks ago, who saw her across the room and whose expression shifted in a way she filed carefully. She counted 11 names from the ledgers confirmed present within the first 20 minutes. She was at 19 when she found Sonia. She should have expected it. Reyes had told her Sonia would likely be there. She'd processed that information and filed it. But processing information and standing 8 feet from someone who called you Elle in that warm, slightly husky voice, and who was currently wearing a dress that Elena had once told her looked beautiful on her, those were not the same experience. Sonia hadn't seen her yet. She was talking to a man Elena didn't recognize, her head slightly tilted, laughing at something, and the sight of it was briefly and precisely the most painful thing Elena had encountered in a month of painful things. She looked away. She kept moving. At the 40-minute mark, she was near the edge of the room closest to the low stage where Adrian always made his remarks during these events. He was on the other side of the ballroom, moving with that particular fluency, working toward the stage from a different angle. She checked the time. She looked across the crowd and found his face. He was already looking at her. The distance between them was maybe 40 feet of expensive carpet and 200 years of accumulated criminal infrastructure in one marriage that had never been what she thought it was. And he was looking at her with an expression she had spent 6 years learning to read. And what she read now was not the comfortable confidence of a man who believed he had already won. It was the very beginning of a question. She had about 4 minutes before he reached the stage. She started moving. She was 15 feet from the stage when a hand closed around her arm from behind. Not Adrian. The grip was wrong, too abrupt, no pretense of social contact. She turned. Carver. He was close enough that when he spoke, it was barely above a breath. "You need to step outside with me." "I don't think I do." His grip tightened, not brutally, but enough. "There are 2 ways this ends for you tonight. One of them involves your kid." Her pulse spiked hard and then, almost immediately, went flat. It was a physiological response she'd noticed before, in trauma situations, in the operating room when things went wrong. The spike, and then the cold, functional calm that arrived on its heels, like a second thing. "Let go of my arm," she said. Quiet. Absolute. "You're not in a position to—" "I am a surgeon," she said. "I have been cutting into people's bodies for 15 years. I know exactly how much pressure it takes to cause permanent damage to a wrist joint." She looked at him. "Let go of my arm and step back, or I will make sure you spend the rest of your career explaining to people why your dominant hand doesn't work correctly." He stared at her. She stared back. He let go. She turned back toward the stage. Adrian had reached it. She watched him step up and adjust the microphone and turn that practiced ease onto the room, 300 watts of controlled charm, and the crowd shifted and quieted the way crowds did around him, the almost gravitational pull of someone who had spent decades perfecting the art of making a room feel like it belonged to him. "Thank you all for being here tonight," he said. She was 10 feet from the stage. She could feel the wire against her ribs. She could feel her own heartbeat, which was doing something controlled and rapid and very precise, like a second opinion. "Before we get to the evening's program," Adrian said, "there's something I'd like to address. Something personal." He looked out at the room, and then, with the slow, deliberate quality of a man who wanted to enjoy this, he looked directly at her. "My wife," he said, "has not been well." The room shifted. The particular shift of a crowd that senses it's about to witness something it wasn't told to expect. Elena took a step toward the stage. Adrian's expression moved. For the first time that night, something crossed his face that she hadn't seen before, something unscripted. He registered her movement and his eyes went fractionally wider, and she saw, in that quarter second, the moment he understood that the woman standing 10 feet away from him was not the woman he had planned for. She reached the stage steps. "Elena." His voice dropped, still in the microphone. The whole room heard it. "What are you—" She stepped up. She put her hand on the microphone. "Thank you," she said. "I'll take it from here." And the room, all 300 people of it, went absolutely silent. The silence of an audience that has stopped breathing because it has just realized it came to watch one performance and is about to witness an entirely different one. And Adrian Volkov stood 2 feet away from his wife on a stage in Westchester and looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face in 6 years of marriage. He was afraid. She looked out at the room, at the judges, and the deputy mayor, and the federal prosecutor, and Carver, and Sonia, and all the names from 8 handwritten ledgers standing in their expensive clothes under crystal chandeliers. And she took one breath, clean and full, the kind she took before the first incision, and she began. She did not begin with an accusation. That was the thing people would remember afterward, in the weeks and months when the story had become something the city told about itself. That Dr. Elena Vaughn had stood at that microphone in front of 300 people and had not begun by attacking her husband or condemning the room. She had begun with a fact, one single fact, delivered in the same tone she used to brief a resident before a complicated procedure. "My name is Elena Vaughn," she said. "I have been a trauma surgeon at this hospital for 11 years, and 3 weeks ago, I discovered that my husband had retained a forensic psychiatrist to forge the documentation necessary to have me declared mentally incompetent. The room stayed silent, the particular silence of people who are calculating. His name is Dr. Gerald Whitmore. She let that land. She watched the ripple of it move through the crowd. Some faces she could read, some she couldn't. Most of you know that name. Some of you have paid it. That was when the room changed. It didn't erupt. It didn't do what crowds do in films, with shouting and immediate chaos. It did something more human and more frightening. It fractured. The silence broke into pieces, into whispers, and the specific sound of people beginning to move, to angle toward each other, to perform sudden urgent conversations with whoever was standing next to them. The guilty and the merely implicated behaving, for one unguarded moment, identically. Adrian had not moved. He was 2 feet to her right, and he had not moved since she'd taken the microphone, and she was aware of him the way she was aware of unstable things in the operating room, precisely, peripherally, without looking directly. "I want to be clear about something," Elena said. The microphone picked up her voice cleanly. She kept it level. She had rehearsed the cadence of this, not the exact words, she hadn't scripted it, but the rhythm of it, the controlled descent from statement to evidence to implication, the same rhythm she used when presenting a complicated case to a review board. "This is not a personal dispute. What I'm describing to you tonight is a system, a mechanism that has been used at minimum 5 times over the past 6 years to neutralize people who became inconvenient." She reached into the small clutch she'd carried in, which Adrian had never thought to question because she always carried a clutch to these events. Inside was a single folded document, a summary page prepared by Marcus of the key transactions from the ledgers. 8 names, 14 dates, the amounts. She unfolded it. She looked at it once, then she looked up. "The Honorable Martin Feld." She said it the way you'd say any name, plainly. "District Appeals Court, $73,000 between March and November of 2021. Routed through a shell corporation called Meridian Advisors, LLC, received in exchange for favorable rulings in 3 civil asset cases directly benefiting the Volkov organization." Feld was near the east windows. She knew because she'd mapped him 40 minutes ago. She didn't look at him. She kept her eyes moving across the room generally, the way a good speaker does, making the whole room feel addressed. "Deputy Mayor Collins, $112,000 across 8 payments beginning in 2020 in exchange for—" "This is outrageous," a man's voice from the crowd. She didn't identify the speaker. She continued, "In exchange for regulatory interference in 3 zoning decisions, and the delay of a building inspection that would have exposed the use of a Volkov-held property as a money transit point." "Stop." Adrian's voice, quiet, close. She didn't stop. She named 4 more names. With each one, she gave the amount, the date range, the code from the ledgers, and the specific service rendered. She kept her voice at the same pitch throughout. Even, clinical. The voice of someone presenting a biopsy result. Here is what the tissue shows. Here is what it means. Here is what happens next. She felt Adrian move. He was reaching for her arm, not aggressively, in the way of a man who was still performing, who still believed this could be contained, that he could pull her gently away from the microphone and the whole room would allow him to manage this the way he managed everything. She stepped sideways. 1 step, clean. She looked at him directly for the first time since she'd taken the stage. His face was a thing she would carry for a long time afterward. Not the fear she'd seen earlier, that had resolved into something else, something harder and more familiar. The look of a man who has realized that the tools he reaches for are no longer where he left them. "The documentation supporting everything I've just described," she said into the microphone without breaking his gaze, "is currently in federal custody. It has been there for 48 hours. From the far end of the ballroom came the sound of doors opening. Not the main doors, the service doors, the ones that opened from the catering corridor and from the East Garden entrance, and the sound was not the sound of waitstaff. It was the particular sound of multiple people entering a space with purposeful coordination, and every person in that ballroom who had something to hide recognized it on a frequency below conscious thought, the ancient animal recognition of consequence arriving. Adrian looked at the doors. He looked back at Elena. "You have no idea," he said, low enough that only she could hear it, what you've just done. I know exactly what I've done, she said. I've done it very carefully. She stepped back from the microphone. Postam. What happened next took 11 minutes, which was shorter than she'd expected and longer than it felt. Reyes came in through the east garden door with 4 agents behind her. 2 more entered from the catering corridor. The local law enforcement presence that had been staged in the drive came through the main entrance last, which Elena understood was intentional. Reyes had structured the entry point so that every major exit was covered before the main doors opened, so that the first instinct to run toward the lobby would resolve into a blocked corridor. The room did not go quietly. That was also not what it did in films, she would think later. It did not erupt into a single coordinated panic. It broke into individual human decisions, some of which were loud and some of which were very quiet, and each one was its own small catastrophe. The deputy mayor attempted to leave through a side corridor that opened near the library. He was stopped within 40 feet. Judge Feld did not move. He stood near the east windows and looked at his own hands and looked very old. The federal prosecutor, whose name was in the ledgers, who had successfully buried 3 cases over 4 years, sat down at one of the event tables and put his head in his hands and said nothing. He was still sitting like that when an agent reached him. Carver moved toward Elena. He got within 10 feet before a federal agent who had been standing 3 feet away from him for the past 9 minutes stepped into his path, and Carver stopped and looked at the agent and looked at Elena, behind the agent, and said something she couldn't hear. She didn't need to hear it. She turned away. She was looking for Adrian. He was gone from the stage. She'd registered his movement at the edge of her attention during the first minutes after the doors opened, and she'd noted the direction, not toward the main hall, not toward the exits, toward the back of the ballroom, toward the door she knew led to the library, and from the library to the archive room. She walked after him. An agent appeared at her shoulder. Young, male, she didn't know his name. Dr. Vaughn, we need you to stay. He's going to the archive room, she said without stopping. There's a connecting door from the library. The archive has a service exit that opens to the north side of the grounds. If he reaches it before your people cover that exit. The agent was already speaking into a radio at his collar. She kept walking. The library was dark. She found the light switch from memory, left side of the door, shoulder height, and clicked it on. The connecting door to the archive room was ajar, 3 inches, light coming through the gap. She pushed it open. Adrian was at the desk. He was not running. She'd expected him to be running, to be moving, to be the kinetic, controlled version of himself that she'd watched work rooms and manage crises for 6 years. Instead, he was standing behind the desk with his hands flat on its surface and his head slightly bowed, and he looked, for the first time in her memory, like a man whose body had stopped knowing what to do next. He looked up when she came in. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The archive room was small, 4 walls of shelves holding estate records and financial folders with dated tabs, a single overhead light, the desk, 2 chairs. She'd been in this room once before, looking for a pen. She'd found one, and she'd also seen, that time, the row of ledgers on the bottom shelf, which she now knew were not estate records. Adrian looked at her for a long moment. "How long?" he finally said. 3 weeks. Something moved through his expression. "The night you didn't come home." "Yes." He straightened slightly. Not composure. It wasn't that. Just the physical habit of a man who had spent decades using posture as armor. "I underestimated you." "You didn't estimate me at all," she said. That was the problem. He looked at the surface of the desk. She could see the effort he was making, the reaching for something, some frame of response, some version of this conversation in which he still held a functional position. She watched him fail to find it. "The pregnancy," he said. Her jaw tightened. "You knew." "Whitmore's surveillance. They were thorough." He said it without expression. "When did you find out?" "Before the hallway. I was coming home to tell you." He went very still. She watched it land on him, the specific weight of that timing, the thing he had not known, the version of that night that existed in parallel to the one he'd engineered. She had been 40 minutes from giving him a photograph of his child when she'd heard his voice through that door. She had thought, when she imagined this moment, that she would want to see him broken by it. She had thought she would want to watch his face, when he understood what he'd been 40 minutes away from, what he'd traded it for. What she actually felt was nothing she had a clean name for. It was too dense, too mixed up with everything else. "There are agents outside that service door," she said, "and covering the north grounds. You know that." "I know." "Then you know there's nowhere to go." He looked at her. "I know." The door behind her opened. Reyes came in, unhurried, with two agents behind her. She looked at Adrian, then at Elena, reading the room in the way she had, that rapid, undemonstrative assessment. "Mr. Volkov," she said. Adrian looked at Reyes for a moment. Then he looked at Elena one more time. A look she couldn't fully decode, which was new. She had always been able to decode him. And he straightened his jacket, a gesture so habitual it was almost involuntary, and said nothing else. He walked around the desk. He put his wrists together in front of him. Elena turned away before she had to watch. She sat in a folding chair in the catering corridor for 40 minutes while the ballroom was processed. Someone brought her water. She drank it. She called Marcus from her own phone, which no longer mattered. "It's done," she said when he picked up. "I know," he said. "It's on the news." A brief pause. "Are you all right?" She looked at the wall of the catering corridor, institutional white, a food safety certification hanging at eye level. "I'm not sure yet." "Fair enough." Another pause. Brennan tendered his resignation this afternoon, before any of this. He knew it was coming. He did. "I'll deal with it." Marcus's voice was doing the thing it did when he was managing his own feelings through professional language. "The estate documentation is clean. Your father's trust is intact. Everything Adrian tried to position against it will dissolve without the judicial cooperation he was depending on." She breathed. "And Whitmore?" "Picked up 2 hours ago. Voluntary surrender, apparently. His attorney called ahead." A brief silence. His attorney also, I'm told, mentioned a Patricia Halve. Elena closed her eyes for a moment. "Is she—" "The commitment order is being reviewed by a federal judge tonight. It's not instant, but it's moving." He paused. "She has a daughter who's been fighting this for 14 months. She opened her eyes. "Okay," she said. "Okay." She thanked Marcus and hung up and sat in the folding chair until her legs felt solid again, and then she stood up and walked back through the ballroom, which was emptying now, the last of the guests being processed and cleared, crystal glasses still standing on tables, a string quartet's equipment abandoned mid-setup, the whole careful architecture of an evening that had been designed to destroy her standing in the mess of itself. She found Reyes near the main entrance. "Sonia Belair," Elena said. Reyes looked at her. "What about her?" "She's in this room somewhere." "What happens to her?" "We'll speak with her." Reyes's voice was neutral. "Her level of involvement determines what comes next." "She's not in the ledgers." "No." Reyes paused. "That doesn't mean she's clean. It means we don't have documentation yet." Elena nodded. She looked across the ballroom. She didn't see Sonia. She thought about the warm, husky voice on the phone 2 weeks ago. "I feel like I haven't actually seen you." And she thought about 15 years of dinners and emergencies and the particular intimacy of someone who had known you long enough to know which version of your voice meant you were actually fine and which version meant you weren't. She thought, "I will never know exactly how much she knew. I will probably spend some time trying to figure it out, and then I will stop, because it won't change anything that matters." She had thought she would want answers from Sonia. Standing here, she found she mostly wanted to leave. "I need to go," she told Reyes. "We'll need a formal statement in the next 24 hours." "I know. I'll be there." She walked out through the main entrance, past agents and guests and a news van that had appeared in the drive with a speed that suggested someone had made a call early in the evening. She kept her head down. She reached the end of the drive and flagged a car with her phone and stood in the cold Westchester air and breathed. The wire was still against her ribs. She reached into the neckline of the dress and deactivated it the way she'd been shown, and felt it go quiet. And for the first time in 3 weeks, there was no active mechanism running against her skin, no recording device, no one listening, and the silence of it was enormous. She got in the car. She gave the driver the address of the hotel. She looked out the window at the dark Westchester Road and said nothing and felt everything she hadn't had time to feel arrange itself in a rough and patient line, waiting. The months that followed were long in the way that complicated things are long, not slow but dense, each week carrying the weight of several. The federal case moved with the particular grinding momentum of large institutional machinery, which meant it moved slowly and without drama and produced outcomes that were real even when they didn't feel it. Adrian was held without bail pending trial. His attorneys were competent and expensive and achieved several delays that his attorneys were paid to achieve, and none of the delays changed the underlying mathematics of 8 ledgers and 60 witnesses and a federal agency that had spent 14 months building a foundation that Elena had, in 3 weeks, given a roof. He was convicted on 23 counts. The sentencing happened on a Tuesday morning in federal court, and Elena was not present for it. She read the terms in a brief notification from Marcus that arrived at 7:48 in the morning while she was eating breakfast, and she put her phone down and finished her eggs. The sentence was long enough that the specific number felt almost abstract. Whitmore accepted a plea agreement that included, as a condition, his full testimony regarding every competency proceeding he had conducted on behalf of the Volkov organization. 6 proceedings over 5 years, 4 individuals, beyond Elena, who had been targeted. Patricia Halve was released from the facility in New Jersey 11 days after the gala, after a federal judge vacated the commitment order in a ruling that was, according to the news report Elena read on her phone at the hospital, 18 pages long and described Whitmore's evaluation as demonstrating deliberate and systematic falsification in every material respect. Halve gave one interview. Elena read the transcript rather than watching the video. Halve was 51 years old and had a daughter who was now 23 and who had spent 14 months fighting for her mother's release while working 2 jobs. Elena read that part twice and then put the transcript away and went back to her rounds. She did not give interviews. The media wanted her. For about 3 months, the story was the kind of story that media organizations build temporary infrastructure around. The surgeon, the mafia boss, the gala, the wire. It had every element that such things require, and Elena had learned enough in the months of careful operational movement that had preceded that night to understand that the moment she stepped into that narrative as its protagonist rather than its architect, she would lose control of every aspect of it. She said no to everything. She issued 1 written statement through Marcus's office, 2 paragraphs, which confirmed that she had cooperated with federal authorities and that she had no further comment on ongoing proceedings. Marcus handled the rest. What she did instead was work. She went back to the operating room 12 days after the gala, cleared by the hospital's review board after a brief administrative leave that was more procedural than substantive. Her first case back was a 34-year-old man with a traumatic aortic injury from a construction accident, and she stood at the table for 6 hours and did the things she had been trained to do, and at the end of it, he was alive. Her chief of surgery, a tall woman in her 60s named Dr. Patricia Osei, who had been Elena's professional ally for 7 years, and who expressed affection primarily through a willingness to give you the hard shift when she thought you needed to work through something, put her on the complex cases that winter, one after another. She didn't ask if Elena was ready. She just scheduled her. Elena understood this as the most functional expression of support available to her and accepted it accordingly. She was 5 months along when the apartment was finally hers alone. The townhouse had been sold as part of the asset resolution. Its ownership structure had been complicated by Adrian's financial arrangements, and the unwinding of it had taken 4 months of legal work that Marcus oversaw with the meticulous intensity of a man making up for what his associate had enabled. The proceeds, after federal claims, were less than the property's value, but more than Elena needed. She found an apartment 10 blocks from the hospital. 3 bedrooms. More than she needed currently. Enough for what was coming. She painted the 2nd bedroom herself. Not out of any particular commitment to the activity, she was not someone who had ever found painting walls meditative, but because it was a Saturday in February and she had the time and she wanted to do one thing with her hands that wasn't surgery. She chose a color that was neither pink nor blue, a warm neutral that the paint store employee described as antique linen, which seemed like an appropriate name for something that would be the first thing her daughter saw when she came home. She knew it was a daughter by then. She'd found out at her 20-week scan, alone in the examination room, looking at a much clearer image than the one she'd been carrying in her coat pocket for all those weeks. Not a comma anymore. A person. Clearly and unmistakably a person, with a profile and a fist and a heartbeat that the technician described as strong. Elena had thanked the technician and gotten dressed and walked to the parking structure and sat in her car for about 12 minutes. She didn't cry. She had cried a total of 3 times in the previous 4 months, each time alone, each time briefly, with the particular efficiency of someone who had found a functional relationship with grief and was managing it accordingly. This was not one of those moments. This was something else, something quieter than grief and more durable. The sense of a shape resolving out of fog. She drove to Marcus's office and told him she needed to update her estate documents. He looked up from his desk. He looked at her. "Congratulations," he said. It came out gruff and genuine in the way that Marcus Hale's rare personal statements always did. "Thank you," she said. "I want everything structured correctly before May. I'll have the documents by Thursday." Gregor got his immunity agreement and his new name and the third thing he'd asked for, a place outside the country where no one knew where he went. She didn't know the name of the country. She didn't ask. He called her once, 3 months after the gala, from a number that didn't resolve to any location she could identify. "You're all right?" he said. "I'm all right. And, he paused. "Still here," she said. "She's fine." A brief silence. "Good." Another pause. "The secondary faction. 3 of them took plea agreements last month. The other 2 are contesting." "I know, Marcus keeps me updated. It's going to take years. Most things do." She paused. "Thank you, Gregor, for the ledgers. Even the way you did it." He was quiet for a moment. "I used you. You used me in a direction I was already going." She kept her voice even. "There's a woman out of a psychiatric facility in New Jersey because of what we found. I'll take the math." He said something she didn't quite catch. Then the call ended. She didn't hear from him again. The letter from Adrian arrived 14 months after the gala. It came through his attorney's office to Marcus's office, which passed it to Elena with a cover note from Marcus that said simply, "Your decision." She let it sit on her kitchen counter for 4 days before she opened it. It was handwritten, 3 pages. In the precise, economical script she recognized from 6 years of grocery lists and signed cards and the occasional note left on the kitchen counter when he'd gone out early. He didn't ask for forgiveness. That was the first thing she noticed, reading it. He didn't ask for anything. He didn't describe the conditions of his incarceration or suggest that he had suffered sufficiently or construct any argument for reconsideration. He simply wrote about what he understood now that he hadn't understood before, with the flat and careful honesty of a man who had had a great deal of time in a small space with his own history. He wrote about her father, which surprised her. He wrote that he had met her father 4 times before the man died, and that he had understood him, in the calculating way he understood most people, as a sum of leverage points and vulnerabilities, and that it had taken 14 months in federal detention for him to understand that the reason he'd been wrong about Elena was that he had applied to her the same assessment he'd applied to her father, and her father had not been what he'd assessed him as either. He wrote that he thought the inheritance had never been the point for her, that the point had been something he didn't have a word for, but that had to do with what her father had believed she was capable of. He wrote that the ultrasound photograph had been in Whitmore's surveillance file. She sat with that for a long time. He had known about the pregnancy, she'd understood that since the night of the gala, but seeing it in writing, knowing that the first image of her daughter had been in a file compiled for the purpose of destroying her, had an ugliness to it that landed differently in the quiet of her kitchen than it had in the chaos of everything else. He wrote, at the end, "I don't know what kind of person she is yet. I don't think I've earned the right to ask. But I wanted you to know that the understanding of what I was 40 minutes away from having on that night is something I carry, not as a claim, just as the truth of it." She put the letter down on the table. Her daughter was asleep in the next room. 10 months old, with dark hair and a specific and somewhat imperious manner when she wanted something, and a laugh that had recently emerged from nowhere and that Elena had not been prepared for. The shock of it, the ordinary miracle of a person finding laughter. Elena sat at the kitchen table with the letter in front of her for a while. She did not write back. She wasn't ready for that, and she wasn't sure she ever would be. And she had made a decision early in the year to stop forcing herself toward emotional conclusions before they were ready just because other people's narratives about recovery operated on a different schedule. She would know when she knew. She would do what she could do when she could do it. What she did was fold the letter and put it in the back of a drawer in her bedside table. Not because she intended to return to it often, but because destroying it felt like a different kind of untruth. She washed her hands at the kitchen sink. It was a habit she had never managed to shed. The surgeon's reflex, soap and water, 30 seconds every time. She stood at the sink and listened to the apartment around her. The refrigerator's hum. A taxi somewhere below the window. The soft sound of her daughter shifting in the next room. Some small adjustment in sleep, settling again into quiet. She dried her hands. She thought about Adrian, who had believed that power was the capacity to move people where you needed them to be. She thought about the room full of names, the judges and the politicians, and the carefully constructed architecture of consequence he'd built over 6 years. All of it pointed at people he needed to remain still. She thought about what it had cost him, not in legal terms, not in years, but in the particular loss of a man who had spent his entire life operating on the assumption that everything could be controlled if you were precise enough, and who had been undone not by a rival or a betrayal, but by a woman who had chosen not to run. She thought about the 40 minutes. She thought about standing on her own front steps in bare feet, with an ultrasound photo pressed to her sternum. She thought, I am still the person who stood there. I am still that exact person. And I am also someone who stood at a microphone in front of 300 people and named every name and felt her own heartbeat under a wire against her ribs and did not flinch. These were not contradictions. She turned off the kitchen light. She checked on her daughter, one hand on the crib rail, listening to the breath, counting it the way she counted vital signs. The professional instinct worn down now into something more personal. The breath was even. The chest rose and fell with the absolute efficiency of someone who had never had reason to doubt that the next breath would come. Elena stood there for a while longer than was necessary. Then she went to bed. She did not dream about the gala. She had not dreamed about it in months. What she dreamed about, on the night she remembered her dreams at all, were smaller things, surgical puzzles, the particular light in her father's study on a winter afternoon when she was 12, her daughter's laugh surfacing and surfacing again in different registers, exploring its own range the way a person tests new territory. Not resolution, exactly, but the shape of a life resuming. She woke at 5:40 before the alarm. She lay in the dark and listened to the city beginning. The first sounds of it, a truck somewhere, a voice 2 floors below, the particular anonymous energy of a place that contains millions of lives and knows yours as only one of them. She had surgery at 7. She got up.